I've traveled internationally for most of my life, and some of the biggest lessons I've learned didn't come from guidebooks, travel blogs, or even planning. They came from mistakes. Mistakes that left me stranded, stressed, embarrassed, and occasionally wondering what on earth I was thinking. Looking back, every one of them taught me something I still use today. And one of them almost created a major problem before my trip had even begun. So today I'm sharing 5 international travel mistakes I'll never make again and how they changed the way I travel. Welcome back to Gracefully Lori. I'm Lori. If you're new here, this channel is for women who want to live authentically, express themselves with intention, and move through the world with quiet, modern grace. One of the reasons I love travel is that it teaches you about yourself. It teaches you how to handle uncertainty, how to adapt, how to solve problems. And sometimes it teaches you lessons you would have preferred to learn another way. The good news is that those lessons tend to stick. So if you travel internationally or would like to travel internationally one day, here are 5 mistakes I learned personally and how to fix them. Let's start with the mistake that taught me an important lesson about technology. Mistake number 1. My first mistake began with complete confidence. I had a destination, I had a route, I had a GPS telling me exactly where to go. So, what could possibly go wrong? I was driving in Ireland and selected the quickest route on my GPS. At first, everything seemed normal, but then the roads became narrower and narrower and narrower. Eventually, I found myself driving on what barely qualified as a road. In fact, I'd describe it more as a path. When another vehicle approached, one of us had to pull off into what was essentially a field so we could pass one another. I remember looking around and thinking, this cannot possibly be the route most people use. Because, if we're honest, most of us have been conditioned to believe the GPS knows better than we do. A little while later, when I was back on actual asphalt, I had to pull off the road with a flat tire. I'm not claiming the GPS caused the flat tire, but it certainly helped put me in a situation I should not have been in. The lesson wasn't really about roads, it was about my judgment. Technology can be incredibly helpful, but it should support your judgment, not replace it. Today, when I'm driving internationally, I usually prioritize major roads whenever I can, even if it takes a little longer, and I always take a moment to sanity check a route before blindly following it. And that has saved me more than once. Unfortunately, the next lesson involved something much harder to replace than a tire. Mistake number 2. Most of us think about features when choosing a handbag for use when traveling. Maybe appearance, maybe size, maybe organization. I certainly did. While security was something I was always supremely conscientious of, one day I was less than vigilant and I had my shoulder bag cut away. A thief had approached from behind and sliced through the thin strap. Thankfully, I had already learned another travel lesson years earlier. Never carry everything important in one place. In fact, most of my valuables were stored back in the hotel safe. So while it was upsetting, it certainly wasn't disastrous. I just lost some cash and a hotel card, which had been removed from its sleeve so the room number couldn't be known. But it changed how I think about travel security. I pay closer attention to where I am. I also pay attention to bag structure, and now I always prefer thicker straps for my shoulder and crossbody bags. And I continue to think carefully about what I carry at what times. The goal isn't paranoia, it's preparation. Because when something unexpected happens, preparation often determines whether the situation becomes an inconvenience or a crisis. And speaking of unexpected situations, my next mistake taught me something about schedules, or more accurately, what happens when you don't leave enough room in them. Mistake number 3. For years, I planned my travel on a tight schedule because I didn't want to waste a moment. If a connection technically worked, I booked it. If I could arrive and immediately begin sightseeing, even better. I wanted to maximize every minute. Then one trip taught me a different lesson. My first flight arrived late for my international layover. Not dramatically late, just late enough. The problem was that I had underestimated how much time it would take to move through the airport. If you've traveled internationally, you know that sometimes getting from one place to another inside an airport can feel like a journey all by itself. There are trains, shuttles, escalators, security checkpoints, long corridors, unexpected delays. By the time I reached my gate, the decision had been already made for me. My plane was gone. And suddenly, The carefully planned itinerary wasn't so carefully planned anymore. I had to rebook and reorganize everything that came after it. The lesson wasn't that flights run late. We all know they do at times. The lesson was that building a schedule that requires everything to go perfectly is rarely a good strategy. Today, I build margin into almost everything. Flights, connections, arrival days, transportation, because margin is one of the cheapest forms of insurance you'll ever buy. And that lesson became especially important when I discovered a problem that no amount of rushing could solve. The next mistake didn't happen during a trip. It happened before the trip even began. Mistake number 4. Everything was booked. Flights, hotels, plans. The trip was coming together beautifully. Then I happened to notice something. My passport expiration date, or more specifically, how much time remained before it expired. As many of you likely know, most countries require travelers to have a certain amount of valid time remaining on their passports, often 6 months or more. And suddenly I realized I wouldn't have enough time on my passport at time of travel to be allowed to enter my destination country. And this was a business trip that my company needed me to take. I spent the next few weeks panicking and working to get my passport updated. It was stressful and it was completely avoidable. Passport expiration dates aren't exactly a secret, but it's one of those details that people often don't think about until they're actively preparing for the trip. Now, it's one of the first things I check before planning a trip. Not after booking, before booking, because a 60-second check can prevent weeks of unnecessary stress. But the final mistake in this video wasn't nearly as serious. In fact, looking back, it's probably the one I most laugh about. At least now I do. I certainly wasn't laughing at the time. So, mistake number 5. After returning from one of my many recent trips, I headed to the garage to get my car. Simple enough, except I couldn't find it. I walked the garage. Nothing. I checked nearby sections. Nothing. I became increasingly confused, then increasingly concerned. And eventually, I started wondering whether someone had stolen my vehicle. The truth was far less dramatic. I had parked in a different location than I remembered. What made it even more ridiculous was that I was remembering where I had parked on my previous trip, not the current one. So there I was, confidently searching in the entirely wrong place. Eventually, I figured it out, but not before spending far more time wandering around the garage late at night than I would have liked. Today, I do something incredibly sophisticated. I park in the same garage each time, and I take a picture. That's it. I take a picture of the parking signage with the parking level and section. One quick photo, it takes seconds, and it has saved me countless headaches since then, especially after long trips. When I look back at these mistakes, what strikes me isn't how different they were. It's how similar they were. A GPS route, a travel handbag, a flight connection, a passport, a parking garage. Completely different situations. But every one of them started with an assumption. I assumed the GPS knew best. I assumed my bag was sufficient. I assumed my connection would be easy. I assumed I had plenty of time on my passport. I assumed I'd remember where I parked. Travel has taught me that assumptions are often where unnecessary stress begins. And that's probably the biggest lesson I have learned over the years. The trips that feel easiest aren't necessarily the trips where nothing goes wrong. They're the trips where you've thought ahead just enough that small problems remain small. That's true in travel, and honestly, it's true in life. So I'd love to know what travel mistake taught you a lesson you'll never forget. Please share it in the comments below. I love hearing your stories. And if you're interested in learning more about the travel mistakes I've made along the way, just type mistakes in the comments and I'll do another installment. And if this resonated with you, please like the video and consider subscribing. It helps other women find content that might be meaningful for them too. Until next time, my graceful friends.